Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com. Here to talk about what I think is a significant betting opportunity in this weekend's fight between Carl Froch and Glenn Johnson at 168 pounds. Now, before I go further, just remember the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, before I get into that, let me just briefly give you my post-fight thoughts on James Degale against George Groves. I know many of you have emailed me. I've been tied up on work-related projects. That fight featured a mover, right? Someone who isn't an ambush fighter because he constantly is flicking a jab at you. He's engaging you, right? He's not as far away from you as an ambush fighter like Jean Pascal would be, right? And of course, movers tend to throw combinations. They tend to be active. Keep in mind, George Groves did throw more punches than James Degale in this fight, right? This fight featured a mover, George Groves, and other movers in history, Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Leonard, Andre Durrell, against what I call a deconstructionist, right? A fighter who, if there was no lateral movement in the fight, and if he was able to fight you in a phone booth, would deconstruct you, counterpunch you to death, figure you out, take you out. That's who James Degale is. Other deconstructionists are people like Juan Manuel Marquez, Floyd Mayweather, right? Now, all I can say is boxing is an expectation game. As you're watching a fight the first time, you judge that fight by how well you think the fighters are going to do. Then if one fighter does better than your expectations, you're going to feel that he is winning rounds, right? I believe that George Groves exceeded expectations on the fight. Certainly, at a minimum, let me say to the George Groves fans, he exceeded my expectations. I was actually expecting James Degale to possibly get a knockout in that fight. I think James Degale is more talented than Groves. Quite frankly, James Degale, in my opinion, is one of the most talented men in the sport, right? So I believe George Groves exceeded expectations in the fight, no question about it. The fight was much closer than I anticipated. I'm the first person to say that. Let me also say, too, that as the fight took place, on my channel page, you had 5 or 6 guys scoring the fight as it took place, and it was an eye-opener for me because some of the rounds that I saw one way, guys on my channel page who were watching the fight in real time saw a different way, and we were all commenting on it. By the way, we do this for many fights. It's youtube.com/DWYER70905. Anyone can participate in the ongoing conversation. Now, going into the end of the fight, right, it was my belief going into the last round that James Degale had won the fight. I thought the only way Degale could lose the fight is if he got knocked down in that last round or, outpointed to such an extent that people gave Groves the last round by 10-8, right? And the converse was true. Other people on my side thought the fight going into the last round was a toss-up. Now, understand, the way I scored the last round, I see no way that James Degale could have lost that last round. I thought Degale won the fight by 2 to 3 rounds. I did not think it was that close. I thought it was clear cut. I'll concede that others on my channel page thought that at a minimum the fight was a draw, right? They thought it was much closer than I did. Their scoring of the fight was much more in line with what the judges came down with, right? I believe, though, that when Frank Warren posts this on YouTube, Warren tends to post all of his fights in its entirety on YouTube. I believe that if you watch that fight a second time, I believe that more people than, at first will realize that, quite frankly, James Degale won that fight. There's no big discrepancy on the CompuBox numbers. I believe what you'll find when you watch that fight again is while Groves does successfully get Degale to turn throughout the fight, right? Groves, using lateral movement, wants Degale to pick up his lead foot and to replant it and to have to reset. And let me just point out, too, by the way, that Degale is so advanced that Degale switches his pivot put seamlessly throughout the fight. In other words, Degale not only is able to turn, he's able to, on a dime, switch his lead foot, right? While it's true that Groves accomplishes some of what he wanted to accomplish, let me just say, as you watch the fight a second time, just ask yourself, who's landing the cleaner punches? Right? It's very hard. I would say Degale is by a wide margin. It's very hard to win a fight when the punch stat numbers are virtually even. The other guy is landing the harder punches. He's landing the cleaner punches. He's coming forward, and you're backing up. So I congratulate the Groves people. Let me just say that, quite frankly, I thought this performance was one of Degale's better performances. I actually feel that both of these guys are very talented, but I thought that James Degale should have won this fight by at least a couple rounds. I thought that, if you give Groves the beginning of the fight, I believe that James Degale wins at least 3 of the last 4 rounds in the fight. I thought James Degale actually started to dominate the fight in the middle of the fight. I thought he had timed Groves. He actually cut Groves. Groves was bleeding. He hit Groves with some withering counters. I thought he had Groves timed. I thought he made an adjustment in the middle of the fight. I would encourage you to look at the film. In the beginning of the fight, James Degale is pursuing George Groves, right? He's stepping forward, allowing Groves to move laterally and to hit him with combinations. In the middle of the fight, the adjustment Degale made was, I believe, Degale started to allow Groves to take the lead. And I thought that when Degale stopped pursuing Groves and just stood in the middle of the ring, George Groves started to fall apart. I understand my view is a minority view. I'm just telling it to you as it is. So I'd love to hear your comments on that fight after you've watched it a second time or even before you do. I personally thought Degale won that fight. We'll see what happens in the future. I'm privately hoping the guys don't fight each other right away. I'd like to see them go on with their careers. I'm sure we'll have a head-to-head matchup between these two guys later down the road. Now, let's talk Carl Froch, Glenn Johnson. I don't understand the public sentiment on this fight. I'll be blunt. I have a video up where I've predicted that Glenn Johnson wins the fight. The straddle I'm recommending, believe it or not, is a double underdog strategy. The straddle is Glenn Johnson to win the fight. The odds I'm seeing have him at a plus 300 and higher. Glenn Johnson to win the fight straddled against the under 10.5 rounds. By the way, that under 10.5, believe it or not, you get a plus 275 there. So the straddle I'm recommending is a plus 300 Johnson to win, straddle against a plus 275 under. I believe Carl Froch's only chance of winning this fight is by knockout, even though Glenn Johnson hasn't been stopped since the 1990s. And I'll even go further. While I believe a knockout is a distinct possibility in this fight, I'm not even sure if the guy who gets it isn't Glenn Johnson. So all I can say to the Carl Froch crowd, and I understand I'm sticking my neck out there, but hey, I'm just calling it as I see it. I'm not even trying to be provocative. My question to you, if you're a Carl Froch fan, is when is the last time that Carl Froch has actually faced a lead puncher with superior hand speed to him who's actually going to be the aggressor in the fight? right? Now, I'm not talking about a long jabber like Jermaine Taylor and Mikkel Kessler. I'm not talking about a long jabber. And I'm not talking about a guy who lacks hand speed like Arthur Abraham. Just think about it. When is the last time he's fought a guy who's actually going to be the lead and who's actually going to be fighting kind of like a Manny Pacquiao type fight, coming in at angles on him and literally trying to smother him? Carl Froch, I would argue, needs a slower pace than Glenn Johnson is going to provide in this fight. I'll even go further and say that, Carl Froch, and remember, I've taken Froch in fights. Look up my record with Froch. I took Froch over Jean Pascal. I even took Froch over Andre Durrell. But Froch, to me, and again, styles make fights, needs space to operate and needs a slower pace. I don't think he's going to be able to handle the lack of space that Glenn Johnson gives him, or the fast pace that Glenn Johnson is going to push in this fight, right? I think Froch, there's a distinct possibility that if Froch doesn't land a home run shot, and Froch is blessed with great punching power, right, and accuracy, if Froch doesn't land a home run punch, I believe he gets methodically taken out of this fight. Keep in mind, he was down against Jermaine Taylor. Also, let's look at this just from a background perspective, right? Carl Froch fought Jean Pascal when Jean Pascal was unbeaten. But let's remember, Jean Pascal, as we're finding out, is a low-volume ambush fighter, right? Look at the CompuBox numbers for both of his fights against Bernard Hopkins, where he was outthrown and outlanded in both. He's the opposite of Glenn Johnson, who is high energy, high volume, right? You could never accuse Glenn Johnson of spending a lot of time looking at a guy like Jean Pascal and Bernard Hopkins both did the first 2 rounds of their recent match, right? I would argue, especially since I'm running out of time, that Glenn Johnson has faced tougher opponents than Carl Froch. Let's remember, Glenn Johnson has been fighting at 175. He's actually fought Chad Dawson, right? Chad Dawson, by the way, unlike Froch, is a southpaw with faster hand speed than Froch. And Dawson, I understand he hasn't had a knockout in a while, but Dawson has a huge punch. Keep in mind, Dawson even beat Tomasa Demick in another life, right? Understand, too, that Glenn Johnson has fought Tavares Cloud, who is an unbeaten champion at light heavyweight. Cloud hits at least as hard as Carl Froch, and Tavares Cloud, quite frankly, is explosive with faster hand speed than Carl Froch. Of course, Glenn Johnson has also fought the likes of Antonio Tarver, right? Johnson has been in the ring with A-list guys. Understand, before his fight with Chad Dawson, he actually had an extended training camp with one sparring partner, and that sparring partner was Lucien Boutte, the unbeaten super middleweight champion. And let me just say about Boutte, devastating body puncher, much faster than Carl Froch, and he's a southpaw. So Glenn Johnson has literally been in with A-listers one division up. So here he is at 168. The key thing to watch here is the weigh-in, whether Glenn Johnson makes it comfortably. If Glenn Johnson makes the weigh-in, then what he's going to have in front of him is a slower opponent than Chad Dawson, who can't fight inside and who is accustomed to fighting at a slower pace. Keep in mind, even when Carl Froch fought Robin Reed, Robin Reed isn't the kind of guy who's gonna, have the hand speed and push the issue like Glenn Johnson. I don't think Carl Froch has fought an opponent like Glenn Johnson. Carl Froch's style might surprise some people, I believe, is a Roy Jones type style, right? Carl Froch himself is a bit of an ambush fighter. He doesn't flash his jab that much. I get the feeling Johnson's going to be in his space. I like Johnson to win, straddled against the under 10.5 rounds. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.